Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
I have a solar eclipse story. Did you get any of the solar eclipse out in Arizona? We got close to 90% here in Northern Virginia. It looked like the sun with a chunk taken out of it, just like the partial moon looks like the moon with a chunk taken out of it. I understand from people who saw the full eclipse that it's, excuse the pun, it's like night and day. The partial versus the full. Apparently, the full eclipse is really something to see. The partial, and again, this is like 90%. If you didn't look at it through the glasses, it just looked like an overcast day. My story this week comes from New York from 1978, where a young high school teacher, Patrick Moriarty, was teaching science and said to his students that 50 years from now, on April 8th, 2024, there'll be an eclipse and we should all get together. So mark it on your calendar. And his students did. Fast forward from 1978 to April 8th, 2024, and students started to show up at his home. It had been 46 years since he had invited them. And so the crowd trickles in. They've got lawn chairs. I guess he was expecting at least some. He was cooking hot dogs or whatever it is. At the end, there were over 100 people there. His former students from over the years come down through the 50 years to see the eclipse.
That's a lot of people to remember who you are.
Isn't it? I think the difficulty is actually in the other direction. I'm sure there are teachers that I've largely forgotten, but my teachers stick out in my mind, I think, much more than I stick out in theirs. Because there was one of them, there are hundreds of us.
Yeah, that's right. There's a numbers game there. And I also find that my early teachers, when I sat in a room with the same person all day, stand out much more than when I started switching classes, as you do when you get older.
Right, yeah.
Still, I doubt many of them remember anything about me. There's a headline from the New York Post that Californians are snapping up guns at record rates.
Hang on a second. I thought guns were largely illegal there.
Well, largely yes, completely no. And there are certain ways you can, in fact, own and or use a weapon in California and other ways that you cannot. You may be in a lot of trouble if you're carrying it around, but to have it in your home is a different story entirely.
Okay.
I can tell you that the gun laws when I lived in New York were much more draconian than when I lived in California, to give you one very stark example. But the Californians, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to support this, are linking their gun purchasing behaviors to the influx of illegal immigrants into their midst. So what you're starting to see in California, I suspect, is a bit of a culture clash that, we heretofore haven't seen in California, because it's generally speaking lockstep liberal, right? Most people in California believe most of the same things, so they behave mostly in the same ways. And I think we're seeing a bit of a fissure here, where people are starting to realize that there is at least a danger of crime that didn't exist previously. And what are they going to do? They're going to prepare for it any way they can. And that means they're arming themselves.
How interesting. And I make no comment one way or the other about immigrants. This has nothing to do with the immigration problem, and I don't understand what's going on in California because I don't live there. But what's interesting to me is how someone can be so vehemently, it doesn't have to be leftist, it could be someone on the right, but so vehemently attached to an idea until reality slaps them in the face.
In all honesty, I don't think that's what we're seeing here. I think we're seeing the group of people who don't really agree much in California acting of their own accord.
I see.
But I will say that this is not a prescription for comedy. There is the possibility that this starts to go wrong in the not too distant future. I worry about that a little bit. When people get to the point where they think their own government is not interested in protecting them the way that they used to believe that, they do take matters into their own hands. And when they do, they often act with greater dispatch than a government would have under the best of circumstances.
Yeah.
When that starts to happen, I think you're going to see some fraying around the edges of society in California, and I'm a little concerned with what that might come to look like over time. Some would say, and I think fairly so, that you're already seeing the fraying, and that's why this is happening. Fair point. But you take my point, right, that this is a step that you don't get to backtrack from, at least not in any serious way. I think we might be seeing the hardening of hearts in a way that we haven't in a long while. And when that happens, I think you see the possibility of things going awry. And I worry about that a little bit. The other interesting thing I saw this past week, of course, is Joe Biden forgiving another $7.4 billion in student loan debt.
Just wave of the pen, and taxpayers have to pay for this.
As if by magic, now that debt no longer exists. But of course it does. And this is why it's the foolishness of the week, if I hadn't made that clear already. You can't just forgive a debt. All you can do is shift it from one party to another. What Joe Biden has done is said to a bunch of college graduates, don't worry about your student loan debt. The American people will pick it up.
I doubt he even said American people. I'm sure he said the government.
Well, he said that, but I'm just telling you what the truth is.
Newsflash, government has no money.
That's right. It's only your money, and they take it away round about this time every year.
Right.
You might want to think about that just a little bit, and I don't think people do. There's a pernicious undercurrent here that nobody else talks about, and I thought maybe we should devote some time to the foolishness of the week this week to talk about the longer-term ramifications of student loan forgiveness, figuring that if he gets away with it this time, and you might remember he didn't get away with it last time, the Supreme Court told him to go pound sand, and I'm hoping to God they do it again. But let's just say he was unencumbered by the previous Supreme Court ruling in acting again to do exactly the same thing, so he obviously doesn't care. He wants what he wants. Well, okay, let's assume that this keeps happening. All of a sudden, it's going to make more sense to go to college than it already does.
Right.
And if it makes more sense to go to college, and you know you're not going to have to pay the bill, what do you think the colleges are going to do in response to that? Now, this is basic economics, right? If I'm running a college, I'm thinking, oh boy, this is fantastic. I'm going to raise tuition now.
Yep.
And why wouldn't I? My students don't have to pay it. It's not even going to enter their minds not to come to a more expensive school if they know they don't have to pay for it.
Tuition will go up, and politicians will beat their breasts saying that these greedy colleges and universities are responsible for the rising tuition, and everyone's going to cheer and say, yay, politicians, go do something about those greedy colleges, when in fact, once again, it's actually the politicians who caused it in the first place.
And they are emboldening these colleges to engage in more of the same behavior.
Yeah.
College had become too expensive to begin with. You and I have been on this bandwagon for years. It's not worth it. It's not worth what they charge. It's probably worth it to go to a state school, which is, again, subsidized by the state taxpayers. And from the perspective of a student, that's probably worth it. But when you take the price signal out of a college education, well, who cares what it costs?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just going to get more expensive from here. So 10, 20, 30 years down the road, when college tuition has continued to grow each and every year, remember that it grew because there was no downward pressure on it.
Yeah.
Why not? Because politicians waved it away with the mighty pen.
And when we repeat this story 10, 20 years into the future and say the problem was government to begin with, people are going to say, no, education is too important to leave to the vagaries of the marketplace. We have to have the government involved.
Well, congratulations. You got what you wanted, and this is how it ends. Every single time.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
Speaking of government and increasing prices, you had something you wanted to talk about today.
Well, I wanted to talk about interest rates, but I'll mention in passing, I appeared on the Kim Iverson's show. I will leave a link in the show notes so you can also find it on YouTube. I had no knowledge of her beforehand, but apparently she has a pretty big footprint. She has been a journalist for some time. She was interviewing me on the distribution of income. You and I had talked about this several episodes back, and we had a very good conversation. She said during the interview that she used to lean left and now she's reconsidering based on various things. Anyway, it was a good conversation. What surprised me was the comments, and apparently her listeners must lean largely left because so many of the comments when she posted the interview were along the lines of, and I'll summarize, Davies is full of crap. And that was it. That was the counter argument.
I have found my natural audience. I need to go on that show now because I agree. You're full of crap.
Those of more intellectual bent would take the time to say, no, he can't be right because look at all the homelessness. Or he can't be right because I pay much more for housing than I used to, or whatever it is. And then often the same person would turn around and accuse me of cherry-picking the data. Now, I'm showing data, and we can argue about cherry-picking. There's particular questions that one would ask to pursue that. But to say, no, you're wrong because I look out my window and see this, that's the ultimate of cherry-picking. Here's one observation, and it confirms my belief. Therefore, it must be right.
So you made a lot of friends, is what I'm hearing.
Well, I responded to some of them, and God bless people. There were a number of people who, when I responded, and I've seen this so many times, came back quite reasonably and said, okay, well, maybe you've got a point about this, but what about this other thing? And all of a sudden, I'm carrying on a conversation with a reasonable person. It's like people have to get that first visceral thing off their chest, and once you approach them as a reasonable person, they'll respond in kind.
Here's to hoping. So what are we talking about today?
Topic for today comes from my new job, which is Director of Economic Research for this investment bank. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about interest rates. Question came across my desk last week, and I spent some time thinking about it. What's the long-term outlook for long-term interest rates?
Before we go down that rabbit hole, let's stop for a second and explain what interest rates are.
Yeah, well, here we're asking specifically about 10-year Treasury rates. Now, of course, the thing you got to keep in mind, we say interest rates or interest rates. There are many, many, many different interest rates. And the one that's relevant to you isn't necessarily relevant to me because maybe you're more concerned about a mortgage, I'm more concerned about credit card rates or whatever it is. But for, I would say, the bulk of business financing, what's important, or kind of a touchstone, is this 10-year Treasury rate. So what is the interest rate on 10-year bonds issued by the federal government? And people understand that if you're a particularly risky business, you're going to be several percentage points above that. If you're safer, you'll be maybe only 1 percentage point above that or whatever it is. But this is kind of like the benchmark that people look at for long-term rates, the 10-year Treasury rate.
And how does that relate to when we sit back and talk about what the Fed is up to with interest rates?
You and I have said before, and it's the case, that the way you get inflation is by growing the money supply faster than the production of goods and services. So people know the phrase, more dollars chasing fewer goods. That's inflation. And the way the Fed ultimately fights that is by constraining the money supply. Don't let the money supply grow faster than production of goods and services. Now, the fact is, the Fed doesn't look at the money supply when it's doing this. It looks at interest rates. And what's going on is something very similar to what happens when you drive a car. What makes the car go faster or slower is how much you press on the gas pedal. But if I ask you, how fast are you going? You don't look down at the gas pedal to see how far down it is. You look at the speedometer. And so if the speedometer registers too much, you let up on the gas pedal. If it registers not enough, you push down the gas pedal. And that same relationship is money supply and interest rates. The Fed looks at interest rates, but it's using money supply, the gas pedal, to adjust monetary policy.
But what interest rate is the Fed looking at?
Well, that's a very good question. what the Fed will tend to look at is the federal funds rate. This is the rate at which banks borrow and lend amongst each other. This is the interest rate that, let's say, it responds most quickly. It's most visible to the Fed. There's the least amount of noise in the system when it looks at this thing. But from our perspective, or from a business's perspective, the business isn't borrowing at the federal funds rate. That's for banks. The businesses borrow somewhere around or a little bit above the long-term treasury rates.
Considerably higher. And then considerably higher again for regular human beings when they want to buy a house.
Right. Mortgage rates.
Or if they want to buy a car, right? A car loan is higher still.
To put some numbers to it, the federal funds rate, and I should have looked it up before you had this conversation, but I believe it's actually, I shouldn't even do this from memory. I've got Google in front of me. Let me ask the Google, what is the federal funds rate right now? The federal funds rate, the rate at which banks borrow and lend amongst each other, is 5%.
And just to put that in perspective, that's almost twice what my mortgage was just a few years ago.
Yeah, it's markedly high. You know, this is a number that was for a while near zero.
Traditionally, we're at a very high interest rate environment right now.
Yeah. And I'm pausing because I'm looking up the 10-year Treasury rate. Yeah, the 10-year Treasury rate right now is about 4.5%, which I don't want to step into a big problem here. Typically, the 10-year Treasury rate is higher than the Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate tends to be the lowest market rate. And what's going on right now, the technical term is an inverted yield curve, and we can do several episodes on that, but let's not go there. What we're interested in right now is this 10-year Treasury rate, because this is what businesses largely respond to. The lower it is, the lower other interest rates are that are relevant to businesses, and therefore, the more likely businesses are to borrow money and invest money. And when they do that, they create jobs, they create new products for the future, and that's good for all of us. So generally speaking, low interest rate good, high interest rate bad, as far as that's concerned.
Imagine that.
Yeah. Now, the great question amongst businesses is how much longer are interest rates going to remain high? You know, the Fed pumped up interest rates as it was fighting inflation.
I did a fair amount of digging on this just recently when I was asked, when should we expect an interest rate reduction?
Right, because you want to see it with your mortgages and credit cards and all that.
Yeah, that's right. And that is the question for everybody who wants to borrow money, right? Because if you're borrowing money, you want the rate to be as low as is humanly possible.
Right.
And the inflationary data that was coming in until about a week ago indicated that, yeah, we might actually start to see reductions in interest rates starting in June. And then some data came in.
That's right. But people have been saying that going back to, I want to say September. People were saying, well, before the end of the year. And then it was going to be, well, early 2024. Then it was summer.
But let's say the obvious. They weren't crazy for saying it. They were looking at certain trends that were in evidence. And if those trends continued, then yeah, we would see a reduction at some point in the not too terribly distant future. And with an election coming, the administration has every interest in seeing to it that interest rates come down.
That's right.
And that inflation goes down. And yet, about a week ago now, we found out that's not happening.
It's not happening. It's something that the people in our shop have been saying for a long time, that we're not going to see lower rates anytime soon. We were a voice in the wilderness for a number of months, but now as time goes by, more and more people are saying the same thing.
It may be the case that they go up some more.
Well, it might be. And in asking why this is the case, I've had to come up with some reasonable justification for it. And I think I have one. I point to the burgeoning federal debt and the latest numbers from Congressional Budget Office. The latest numbers from Congressional Budget Office say that the deficit, that's the amount we add to the debt every single year, the deficit is going to average over the next decade $2 trillion per year. Now, a little bit less in earlier years and more in later years. So over the course of the next 10 years, we're looking at adding $20 trillion to our already $33, $34 trillion debt.
Ouch.
Yeah.
What could possibly go wrong?
See, that's the thing. Politicians think nothing's going to go wrong, and a lot of people kind of share that feeling because this is the way we've done business, good Lord, since I was in college. And Reagan ran up his deficits and everybody said, oh my God, the sky is falling, but the sky didn't fall.
Right. The amounts under the Reagan administration are downright cute in comparison to what we've got now.
They're laughable compared to what we've got now.
But there's a bias here that plays, I think, with Americans very specifically, and maybe with Westerners more generally. They take a look at what life is like here, and they ask, how long has life been like this here? And they come to the not crazy conclusion that that's what life will always be like here.
Right.
And that's not crazy, it's just wrong. If you've got 4 generations or 5 generations saying, no, this is what life is like here, you have every reason to believe it will be 6, 7, and 8 generations, but at some point it won't be.
Right.
At some point. And we may be at that point right now.
And, the odd thing is we can look backward, as we just did, and notice that the past was very different. But somehow we've got trouble going the other direction. We look in the future and just assume, well, the future is going to be the same as the present is. No, it's not.
The days of wine and roses will continue forever. Let's all casually forget 1930 ever happened.
Well, there's another problem here, which is well-educated people in this area saying things like, oh, no, there's no problem here because what are you going to do with your money other than put it in U.S. Treasuries? It's the best investment on the planet.
No, it's not.
At the moment it is, but that doesn't mean it's going to continue to be that way.
Look, go buy a house. There you go. Buy real estate. That's a good investment if we're right about what's about to happen here. Hard metals, not a bad investment, precious metals.
Well, the question is, over what time period? Over the course of 5 years, treasuries are probably better.
That's right. If I'm talking to a 28-year-old married couple who want to buy their first home, this probably is not the time.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you've got all kinds of capital laying around and you don't know what to do with it, buying real estate might be the absolute best thing in the world right this second. It's very specific as to your situation in life.
So here's the question that I don't think people think enough about. We've got the federal government looking to borrow $2 trillion a year for each of the next 10 years. And that's going to go on, but CBO only looks 10 years out. Where's it going to come up with the money, right? I mean, it's got to borrow from someone. Who's going to loan $2 trillion a year to the government?
You and I talked about this 3-4 years ago, that the sources for borrowing were running low.
Yeah, and people took issue with us, so let me clarify what we mean by that. We're not saying that there aren't people, businesses, foreign governments that are willing and able to loan to the federal government. What we're saying is the rate at which the federal government has been increasing its borrowing has exceeded the rate at which everybody else is increasing their lending. There's a gap there.
And who's not borrowing anymore? And it's foreign governments, not nearly as much.
No, not nearly as much. People say, well, what about the Chinese? They own...
What about the Chinese?
Do you know, I made, for one of the people at this place where I work, I made a chart of a breakdown of who owns the federal debt. So the public, the intergovernmental, which is Social Security and federal pensions, the Federal Reserve. And someone asked me, well, can you put China on the chart? And I said, I can't, because if I tried to, you wouldn't see it. It's so small compared to the others.
I'm guessing a lot of people didn't believe you.
No, they didn't until you sit down and do the math. China right now owns less than 3% of the outstanding federal debt.
Funny how that turned around.
Yeah, and what's been happening? The Chinese, forget about slowing down how much they loan the government. They've actually been reeling it back. 5 years ago, they owned over $1 trillion in federal debt. Today, I believe it's around $800 billion. So they've substantially cut back on how much they're lending.
And knowing what I know of the Chinese economy and its impending demographic collapse, you can expect that number to dwindle down closer to zero.
I believe you can expect it to continue to dwindle. But the thing is, it's so small now, it doesn't matter. It can go to zero tomorrow. It's not going to be a big deal. But let's go back to this question. The federal government needs to find an additional $2 trillion a year. Who's going to loan that money? Now, CBO gave an answer. If you dig into CBO's projections, they're projecting that the public, and by the public I mean people like you and me, businesses, foreign governments also, that they will lend the federal government this $2 trillion a year. If the CBO is correct, and that's what happens, the public loans this money, the public's share of the federal debt, that is the amount of federal debt the public owns, will rise above 70%. Now, it's only been above 70%, that is 70% of the total debt outstanding, once before, or one period of time before. Any guess when?
World War II.
No. Well, actually, I don't know the answer to that because my data doesn't go back that far. The period of time I have in mind is the late 70s to mid 80s, maybe late 80s.
The Carter-Reagan recession.
Right, when interest rates went through the roof. You could get a CD at a bank for 15%.
You could get it for 18% if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I mean, a mortgage was costing upwards of 20%.
Yeah, it's the last time in modern history that we've had gargantuan interest rates in this country. And what happened? Well, one possible interpretation is that the federal government back then did what it's about to do now. It borrowed so much that it crowded out other investors. It's like if all of a sudden 100,000 people descended on your town and started buying gas. What's it's going to do to the price of gas pretty quickly? It's going to drive it up because all of a sudden there's a huge demand for gas that wasn't there before. So too, when the government steps into the marketplace looking to borrow a bunch of money, it drives up the price of borrowing, and that's the interest rate.
If investing in the market yields me out roughly 8% a year over time, that's not a guarantee, it's an average. Okay, what happens when the government starts paying 9.5? I'm going to take the 9.5 because it's as guaranteed as anything can be. If the government fails, okay, fine, I lose my money. But if the government fails, I'm going to lose whatever I had in the stock market anyway.
Yeah, and think of that from the perspective of a bank. A bank's looking to invest its money. It can loan you money to buy a house, and that's risky because you might not pay it back, or here's the federal government offering 9%. Let's go there instead.
It's really a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And you're going to see these kinds of rates. As a matter of fact, you and I saw a 9% rate not too terribly long ago from the government.
That's right. Yeah, inflation index bonds were 9% a couple of years ago for a very short period, but yeah.
Just about 2 years ago now. And when that's the everyday rate that you can get for lending the government money, you will. But then there's a pernicious effect, right? Because now the government has to pay that interest rate, which means it needs more money to pay off a bigger debt that it just incurred. And before you know it, the thing is a vicious cycle.
Right. The government has to borrow more to pay for the interest expense. And as it borrows more, it drives interest rates up, which increases the interest expense. Yeah, you get into the cycle. But let me go back for a moment to the 10-year Treasury rate, which is currently at whatever it is, 4-point-something%. The last time the public owned 70% plus of the debt, which is what CBO is projecting is going to happen over the next decade, interest rates on 10-year Treasuries bills average 10%. Average 10%. So roughly, you're looking at a scenario in which interest rates are double what they are now. Let me say that again. If the CBO is right and the federal government borrows this money it needs from the public, it may well double interest rates from where they are now. Now, someone's going to say, but hang on a second. The government's been borrowing trillions of dollars, most notably at COVID. And, we didn't see interest rates go through the roof. We did see them ultimately rise. We didn't see them go through the roof. And I say yes, because something different happened during COVID. The government didn't borrow largely from the public, thereby driving interest rates up. It borrowed from the Federal Reserve. In the Federal Reserve, you can borrow as much as you want from the Federal Reserve. It prints the stuff, right?
Well, you might recall they were talking seriously about minting trillion-dollar coins not too long ago.
Right, exactly. Why? Because they can. Here's $1 trillion coin. Now we don't have any problem, right? This is the heart of modern monetary theory.
All our problems have been solved.
Yeah, except we come back to that pesky economic rule that there's no such thing as a free lunch. When the Federal Reserve loans money, unlike anybody else, it increases the money supply. That's what happens when the Federal Reserve loans money. In fact, that's how the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, by loaning money into the market. So if the CBO is wrong and the government does not end up borrowing this $2 trillion a year from the public, instead it borrows it from the Fed, yes, you won't see interest rates double, but you will see inflation spike. And my back-of-the-envelope calculation is what has been, up until recently, this baseline 2% inflation. If the government has to turn to the Fed to finance its borrowing, that baseline is going to go from 2% to 3.5%. So 3.5% will become the new normal for inflation.
Why don't you do something to explain just how painful that is? Because 1.5% doesn't sound like a big difference, but it's a gigantic difference.
Oh, it is, because on the one hand, James, you say it's 1.5%. It's actually technically 1.5 percentage points, because you go from 2% to 3.5%, 1.5 percentage points. That's a 50% increase in inflation. You went from 2% to 3.5%. So in other words, your dollars that are eroded by regular background inflation, that rate of erosion will increase by 50%.
And that's very significant.
Yeah, particularly over a number of years.
Every indicator I can think of tells me that we're running headlong into a European middle-class lifestyle, as opposed to what was typically an American middle-class lifestyle.
I think we're definitely headed into a phase in which the economic footprint of the federal government is much larger, much more like you see in Europe. The question for Americans right now is that what you want? Because if you don't, now's the time to turn around.
Well, you have to make clear what it means, and it means you're going to live a less affluent life.
Yeah.
You're probably going to have one car, not two. Houses are probably going to stop getting bigger. They're probably going to start getting smaller. Things that you find very typically in the European middle class, you'll start finding here. It won't be to the same degree as they have in Europe, but we'll start trending in that direction.
And to avoid the observation bias that James and I were talking about before we started this conversation, be careful when you think about European lifestyle. Do not think about what you experienced when you went to Europe on vacation. That was not European lifestyle. That was American purchasing power in Europe.
And we're certainly not talking about living in a palace. We're talking about having a small home, maybe one, maybe no cars. Right? Doing a lot of your grocery shopping every day on foot.
Possibly not even owning it all. I know in UK, it's pretty rare to own your own home. Most people rent. Or if you don't rent the home, you rent the land that the home sits on.
There are a number of ways this can manifest, but the point here is that it will manifest. You know, you have to start asking some hard questions. And every time, to grab an example, we start by saying, well, this should be free, student loans,
right,
healthcare, whatever.
Yeah.
What you're really saying, diminish my purchasing power.
Right.
You are really saying that. Now, people haven't put two and two together, but those two and two need to be put together.
All of this free stuff, free education, free healthcare, free whatever else it is you want, none of it is free. You pay for it. And right here, in this episode, we're talking about how you pay for it. It's either in higher interest rates, or it's in inflation, or it's a combination of the two, but you will pay for it.
No such thing as a free lunch. You don't have a magic wand where you could just wave away economic reality.
Now, people will ask, in fact, my mother does often when we have an episode like this. She says, all right, but tell us, what can we do about this? How can you fix it? And the answer here is very simple. The fix is simple. Stop spending money you don't have.
That's, yeah, it is simple, but it's never going to happen.
Right, yeah. And by stop spending, I don't mean people. I mean the federal government. In part, it's our fault because each of us puts our hand up and says, oh, we want government spending for this thing over here. And we say, oh, it's just this little thing. It's not a big deal. Okay, right. Whatever this thing is you want, it's not a big deal. But take that little thing, it's not a big deal, and multiply it by 350 million people, each of whom wants a different little thing, and then you've got the $2 trillion deficits.
Because you don't have a single politician with an incentive not to give it.
Exactly.
I've said for years that this will run headlong into a collapse, because what the hell else could possibly happen? And you could do a number of things to forestall that collapse, but that doesn't mean the collapse isn't coming. It is. And the best thing you can do individually is prepare for that, because it's inevitable. You don't want to be all happy and optimistic after I just teed you up like that?
Nah, yeah, I don't think it comes to that. I don't think it comes to collapse. I do think it comes to a long-standing dull ache. We're not going to drop dead, but we are going to have a serious hangover that may last for multiple generations.
Yeah, no, I would have a bet with you on this matter, but if I won, there would be nothing to collapse. It literally makes no sense for me to have this wager, none whatsoever.
I could pay you in tomatoes.
That's right, and to get those tomatoes from Virginia to Arizona, probably a sucker bet on my part. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.